Welcome everyone. My name is Karolina Łukasiewicz. Together with the Laboratory of Urban and Regional Migration Policies at the Center of Migration Research, and my colleague Marta Pochocka, who works there, and Migration Academy and Migration Consortium, represented by Magdalena Nazimek. We would like to welcome you to this webinar. We co-organize it also together with the Union of Polish Metropolises and Research Committee Migration and Citizenship of the International Political Science Association. Today in this webinar, we would like to focus on immigrant integration practices in international and also multi-level perspective. Integration policies facilitate inclusion of newcomers to the housing and labor markets, education, healthcare system, and the policies are designed and implemented in many different ways across global north countries. In some cases, they are designed at the central level and implemented by different public agencies locally. In other cases, they are only funded centrally, but then implemented and also co-designed locally by sometimes public institutions, sometimes non-profit organizations. So there are many different levels and many different ways the policies operate. Different groups are eligible to use those policies and programs. So during this seminar today, we will look at 5 different cases, including countries with a very long history of immigrations, such as Canada, countries which are to different levels decentralized, such as Germany or Italy, and more centralized Central Eastern European countries who pioneer in developing integration policies in the region, such as Czechia. So we will use those different examples to look how integration policies can operate. And we organized this webinar from Warsaw, Poland. Poland is currently in a very unique situation. As we speak, a new government is working on creating a new country's migration strategies and to different extent reshaping integration policies. So we hope this webinar will help in this process. And that's enough of my intro, and I will give the floor to Marta Pochocka, who will introduce our distinct speakers. Go ahead, Marta.
Thanks, Karolina, for this very kind introduction. So we are very happy to see once again many of the names are the colleagues that are like frequent participants of our CMR series. And as you know from the invitation to this event today, in line with our tradition, we have 5 speakers, highly feminized panel, I have to say, because this time, and this is fully by accident, we have only female speakers invited from different countries. And I hope that you will learn a lot from them. So let me briefly present our colleagues. Professor Magdalena Nowicka from DESIM, German Center for Integration and Migration Research in Berlin. Dr. Mari Jelinkova, Assistant Professor at the Department of Public and Social Policy, Faculty of Social Sciences at the Charles University in Prague. Dr. Melissa Moralli, Assistant Professor at the Department of Sociology and Business Law at the University of Bologna. Dr. Vilde Hernes, Senior Researcher at the Oslo Met in Norway. She will join us a bit later. And Professor Jennifer Hindman, Associate Vice President for Research and Innovation, York University, Toronto, Canada. So our speakers will have around 12-15 minutes per contribution. There will be some presentations that you can follow. And when we were preparing this webinar, we suggested some questions to our dear guests about how the integration policies are understood, how they are implemented, who the main actors from different sectors are, what are the, for example, responsibilities at different levels of migration governance, and also what are the good practices or lessons learned that can be helpful for the countries like Poland that are going this transition of migration status. So I invite you to this intellectual journey across different countries, and we will start with our colleague that was introduced as the first one, so Professor Magdalena Nowicki. Magda, the floor is yours. Please share your screen.
Yeah, I hope it works. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. That's indeed a challenge to explain the integration policies and measures in Germany within like 10 to 15 minutes, but I'm gonna try. The first thing I thought it needs to be explained is the levels of responsibility, because we can't speak about the content of the policies without understanding how it is linked with the different levels of government in Germany and all the challenges, in fact, and all the maybe shortages of these policies very much are entangled with how the responsibilities are shared between different levels of government. The conclusion comes ahead. There's no definition of integration in Germany, not a single one and not a single policy. The responsibilities are shared between different levels, but also these levels have different responsibilities depending on the field. So if we talk about education, labor market, or housing, or any other field, we might have a very different constellation of responsibilities. That makes it very tricky to understand, because there are both very different vertical linkages within this federal system as well as horizontal. And of course, actors at each level might have very different agendas, very often contrary agendas, not only because they may be of different political option, but also they might simply follow their integration policies from very different structural perspectives. The system is complex. It has been criticized for this kind of complexity. It is largely intransparent, I think, also to most of the integration scholars, and it's sometimes inconsistent. That's why it has been criticized. I think not a single person in Germany having an idea of what the government should do is really able to say which government they mean and what does it really take to. Now, these are 16 federal states. There is a federal government, and I will refer always to states, to the 16 different federal states, to the federal government. That's a kind of national government, but there are also municipalities. And when I speak here about municipalities, the picture is more complex in Germany in general, because there are different kinds of municipalities. Some are administrative districts, some are counties, some are cities, some are associations, and 11,000 municipalities. And depending on the constellation, they also have different competences, and there's also a hierarchical structure behind. Now, just to take the example, education is one of the fields that is kind of key for integration in general understanding, because people gain qualifications that are prerequisite for their access to work and to income. The degree of intervention of the state in this field is relatively high, and there's a certain model of collaboration between the three levels of government. I will explain this model in a moment. It's called the diamond because it looks like. There's a labor market policy, which looks slightly different. It's also one of the key fields of integration, because being integrated in the labor market means having an income, but also in Germany in general, labor market has been understood as essential for social and cultural integration of migrants. Nevertheless, the state intervention is rather of a middle kind. And there's different responsibility in the so-called hourglass model. Housing, on the other hand, represents another model, which looks more like a pyramid. I will show it in a moment. Housing is very important because of the access to education and to labor market integration in the municipalities, but still the degree of state intervention is rather low. And just to give an idea of this kind of models and how the responsibilities could be shared between different levels of government. In the diamond model, in fact, this is not the federal government that has a lot to say. It is because the educational policy, as a best example for this diamond model, has traditionally been the responsibility of federal states, and they regulate most of the issues related to the education. So the federal government only has very few programs supporting the states. These are temporary, they have to be, because otherwise it would no longer be a competence of the federal states or would limit their responsibility and independence. They are sometimes targeting, but very rarely in relation to foreigners. But there are also municipalities which in fact run the schools, for example, so they have a task to implement regulations that are at the level of the federal states. So that's why the diamond model. Now we have the hourglass model, which is representing the labor market field. Here, the federal government has a lot to say. It's regulative. The regulation law relates to all kind of aspects of labor, wages, but also replacement benefits, and that's also quite important for foreigners and for the refugees. The federal states, though, are responsible for vocational training, and they implement, for example, the regulations on the recognition of foreign qualifications. Still, their role is minimal in this sense. It is municipalities that more and more, and there has been a change in the policies, are responsible not only for the implementation of the regulative laws set at the federal level, but they are also having their own instruments and they have a coordination role. So at the bottom, so to say, we also have similar importance, at least in relation to the labor market integration of immigrants and refugees. And the third one is the pyramid model. Here, the federal government has very little say, and this is in housing policy, for example. There are governmental policies, but in general, we observe since more or less 20 years withdrawal of the federal government and decentralization of the responsibilities in relation to housing. The federal states do have some regulatory powers, similar to the federal state, but they have responsibility for social housing, and that's why in their integration policies, they gain more importance. But it is municipalities that have most of the tasks and responsibilities for offering housing, both to anybody, but also to the refugees and to the immigrants. So that's how these three different constellations are possible depending on the field. So we can't say that this is always the federal level regulating and other levels implementing, but we have very different constellations according to the fields. Now, we just look at the federal government still, what is there to be done? Because when we speak about the federal government, very often we mean the immigration policies, in fact. The German government is primarily responsible for immigration laws, for example, attracting foreign labor or regulating access to asylum. But it does so also under control or in cooperation with federal states. Integration has become the field of responsibility for the federal government only in 2005. And since then, we observe something what is sometimes called hyperactive state. So the state is doing a lot of regulation, changing the rules for integration, especially, for example, in labor market access, where it can be very active all the time. So every couple of months in the last years, at least 10 years, we observed very many changes to the regulations in this field. But there's still no official definition of integration. The executive agency is very important for the federal level. This is the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, because it administers the whole asylum application process. It is also responsible for the integration courses, and these are both, they have two components, language and orientation. It also runs different programs supporting integration, including the largest funding for NGOs, so for migrant organizations in this area. It also is responsible for counseling services for migrants, but this is implemented by welfare organizations. BAMF is also organizing yearly an integration summit of the government. It has a research department, quite a large one, and it's also responsible for international coordination. There are also at the federal level single ministries and their activities. Usually these are just projects, campaigns, funding, sometimes research, and they are, according to their scope of interest, they are responsible for example, labor market programs, family integration, or maybe active in the field of culture or health or anything else. So that's a combination of what we could call a federal government integration practices, policies, instruments. Now, the federal states, the 16 ones, have also been very active in the field, taking also initiative. The first integration law in Berlin was implemented in 2010, was revised in 2021. In fact, we have now this kind of second phase, revisions of the integration laws. There are states that have an integration law for this federal state, or that ones that are working on such, and some don't have it at all. There is no requirement to have one. But the integration laws, or participation law, that's how Berlin called it more recently, they have similar aims, despite that they are very different. But they have a signaling role for the integration. They signal the importance of this theme. They set a common goal for very different actors and hope this way to achieve more coherence in integration policies. They mainstream usually the integration policy across different fields. They assure also better coordination within administration. Most of them aim at improving conditions for political participation of migrants through, for example, setting rules for integration councils or foreigner councils. They still have very different names, depends where. They are also the legal basis for funding of programs and various instruments, also for funding, for example, of non-governmental organizations in this field. They provide also systematic support to municipalities that implement many of these programs. And one of the very important field of their working is the diversity in public administration. There are different measures set by these laws to increase the share of immigrants in public administration staff. And they usually have regular monitoring of integration indicators. They do reports quite regularly, gathering data on integration progress within the federal state. The last but not least are the municipalities. Very often it's called integration is happens locally. So the municipalities are at least discursively very often given a very important meaning in integration policies. But their tasks are in fact the so-called voluntary tasks in the area of integration, which doesn't mean that they are not active, but that they don't have a steady funding for this. Nevertheless, we could divide the task as strictly related to integration and indirectly related to integration. In general, municipalities are that important because they are responsible for implementing schooling, kindergarten, youth, social or child support. They also run the adult education school. They are responsible for social housing, labor market integration programs, and support to culture and different associations. So they have these very general activities which are always important for the integration of migrants as well. Specifically, they have also responsibility for different affairs of foreigners. Naturalization is also at the municipal level, social welfare for refugees, housing for refugees. They also run houses for unaccompanied minor refugees, and they have also various other services. They also have tasks directly related to integration, and these are, for example, strategic ones like formulation of integration concepts of strategies, but not every municipality has it, and we don't have a very good overview which one of these almost 12,000 municipalities does it or not. They also identify and collaborate with different actors, for example, different organizations, migrant organizations, refugees organizations, NGOs, etc. They should coordinate them, and very often they do, not constantly, but for example, in the times when it's more required, like when there was a huge arrival of people from Syria or Ukraine. And they also monitor in different ways integration processes. They have also responsibilities at the operative level when they provide, in fact, the language courses, or they implement the counseling services at the local level, and they implement the diversity measures in public administration. And I stop here, and I wait for your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda. Could you please stop sharing your screen? Thanks a lot for this very concise and detailed overview of the integration governance in Germany. So now I would like to invite Marii Jelinkova to tell us a few words about the Czech Republic. Please,
Hello.
the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Similarly to Magda, having 10 to 15 minutes to answer all questions is difficult, so I will talk about some bits and pieces. And I will start with a Czech saying, which is, fortune favors those who are prepared. Well, I'm not expert in English sayings, but I try to find something what's closer to that. And the English saying is, forewarned is forearmed. So I believe you understand what it means, and this is exactly what we could see after or in 2022 when it comes to reception, adaptation, and integration of Ukrainians for migrants in Czechia. And I will use the topic of expert knowledge to illustrate, on which I will try to illustrate what worked and what didn't work in Czechia, and maybe that these findings could be understood also as some way of short evaluation of the migrant integration policies. So basically similar to Poland, which most of you is a country that you know quite a lot. The Czech Republic was also very active in the beginning and welcomed tens of thousands of Ukrainian forced migrants. And the cooperation of all actors was, of course, challenging, but reasonably good. But when we, or sometimes even perfect, but when we looked who cooperate and how, we can find out that it was mainly those actors who used to cooperate in the past in times, for example, other crises, like, for example, floods and so on. And also the parts of the state administration which focused on some bureaucratic issues was able to quickly get in. But what was partly lacking was to bring in and implement specific migration-related knowledge. By that I mean, like, for example, to quickly come with some specific programs for unaccompanied minors, or to open the question of human trafficking or issues of exploitation as soon as possible. When we look what happened, we often find out that specific measures were taken at that time and even later, but when we look how these measures or policies were adopted, it was mainly because of the voice and influence of some experts, often from migrant-related or migrant-focused NGOs or academics. And the way how they did it was often not that they would be invited to do it or approach, but it was because it was reactional. So very often they just wrote an email, wrote an article, took a phone and called to somebody who should be accountable for the issue. So why is it important from my perspective? I think that it's that this expertise is crucial to manage the situation well, but very often the expertise had to, or the experts were put in a situation that they heard from some different various state actors that they claimed, well, we do not have this expertise, believing that nobody in Czechia has this expertise. So this was like, this standpoint was very difficult to overcome. And also the Czech Republic is partly specific, that it's mainly the Ministry of Interior who has a very strong position, not only when it comes to migration, but also to migrant integration policies. And this ministry, of course, is by its nature focused mainly on security and not other issues. So they kind of couldn't play or didn't want to play the role to bring also other aspects in the picture. Quite quickly, 14 different groups, working groups, were established in Czechia, and each of these groups should focus on one important topic related to the situation of forced Ukrainian migrants, like, for example, access to healthcare or access to education. And here we could see first significant differences. So when it was a topic where there had already been some cooperation, typically education, we could see that these working groups were able to quickly produce really good results. Especially it was interesting for me to follow the topic of education, where the cooperation among actors wasn't easy because before 2022, but suddenly when they were in a situation that, you know, things needed to be done, they were really able to expand already existing policies and cooperate really well. But in other examples, typically the issues related to social security, where there was little or none cooperation before 2022, the way how the experts were first, they were not, many of them weren't invited, and those who were invited, even they were invited by a formal letter by the ministry. So when they started to say different opinions or contradicted the policies implemented by the states, they were suddenly not invited to other meeting without letting know. So I believe that this approach even mainly strengthened the situation in a way that what worked before 2022 usually worked better, and what didn't work has, let us say, limited growth. Secondly, what was really amazing and interesting to see was the role of UN agencies, because the role of UN agencies in Czechia was important and definitely not easy to evaluate. On first hand, UN agencies brought like a significant financial means, and without these financial means, many implementing policies wouldn't be able to couldn't be implemented. But on the other hand, UN agencies somewhat needed to be or wanted to be quite seen a lot, and very often they opened some topic, they got involved, and they claimed that, you know, nobody has ever dealt with this issue, which usually wasn't true, or often wasn't true. And they worked with some experts. They also worked with NGOs. But I do not hesitate to say that it was sometimes in a at least partly exploitative way, just to get the knowledge, and then be mainly them to be in the picture, which could be acceptable in a way that they would stay for a long time in Czechia, but now, like in the last few months, most of them limited their activities, and in some topics, like, for example, access to housing, the situation is sometimes even worse than it was before 2022, because those people who were involved left, and because of the large involvement of UN agencies, and now there are practically no people working, like, I mean, mainly experts, but sometimes like people in general working on this topic. When it comes to the division of responsibilities, we could see for the first time in the Czech history larger involvement of Czech region. Czech Republic consists of 14 regions, and before 2022 there were many activities on the state level and some activities at the municipal level. And the largest Czech cities have their own concept documents on migrant integration. But this is not the case of regional governments. The regional governments were usually very reluctant to work in this area, partly also because that there is a Center for Integration of Foreigners governed by the Ministry of Interior, mainly by the Ministry of Interior in each region. So the regional governments usually tend to kind of outsource the topic to this center and to Ministry of Interior. But in 2022, they needed to be involved. And because the number of migrants in Czechia increased from 6% to 10%, when we count the Ukrainian forced migrants, they found out, or they happened to be a situation that there is more work need to be done. So they were offered by UN agencies to have paid positions for 2 years for people who would deal with these issues, mainly with forced Ukrainians, but also with migrants in general. And only 7 regional governments accepted this position and 7 refused. So luckily, I have a good PhD students working at the right ministry, so I asked him to help me to search what happened, what are the reasons to refuse. So in some cases, the reason was that the regional government is very right-wing oriented, and they kind of do not claim, they do not believe that there is any need to do something and that everyone should be responsible for himself or herself. So we all know this story. But in other cases, the reasons were, I would say, deeper or different or more complex. When the regional governments were afraid that once they, accept these positions, that they, together with it, that they will also accept the agenda over ownership. So meaning that once the funding will be over, they will still be assigned some tasks they don't have the financial means for. And the last subtopic I would like to tackle on is the role of concepts and strategies. The Czech Republic accepted first integration strategy in 2000. And the last time this document was updated was in 2016, so it's quite old nowadays, but there is an action plan, yearly action plan, which kind of sets visions and tasks for upcoming year and also decides about how the money available will be allocated. But the Czech government, or mainly the Ministry of Interior, who was the most active actor in that, decided that this integration concept will not be used, or will not cover the forced Ukrainians, and that there will be a specific strategical document drafted, and it was drafted, it was accepted, and the reason for that was the idea that these temporary Ukrainian migrants will leave and that their stay in Czechia is only temporary. And here I believe we can see that this is area where they kind of lacked or didn't want to have the expertise, because like there were many experts, me being one of them, claiming that even when the situation will be perfect, still many forced Ukrainians will somehow stay in the Czech Republic. But the Ministry of Interior decided to deal with this agenda and strategies differently. After a couple of months, I think that this specific document lost its role, because it's set tasks for other ministries as well, and the ministries were not willing to cooperate unless there was some strong pressure, like it was in the beginning. Opposite to this national concept, when we look at the integration concept of larger cities, this municipal integration concept and strategies were used and covered also the forced Ukrainian migrants, mainly because they are written in a more, let us say, inclusive and participatory way. So when we look at the main ideas, the ideas resemble the national concept quite significantly, but they are written in a way that they are able to cover also various types of migrants, including the forced Ukrainians. And then only, and then they also have a yearly action plans, but then these plans are then also more specific than the ones who are agreed on the national level. So I hope I tried, or at least opened some parts of the model of integration policies in Czechia and how it worked, how it didn't work. I do not want to conclude too negatively. But actually, personally, for me, it was quite amazing to see how the things, the areas and the policies which were at least partly established and which at least partly worked before 2002 boosted and were well expanded, even though, of course, many issues are difficult to have, to come up with or cover with the functional solutions. But generally, those policies who worked at least partly were functional. But the areas where there were no will or possibility or anything else or something else to develop policies and measures before 2022 didn't work or didn't work well when this after the arrival of Ukrainian forced migrants. But maybe after that we are more able to understand why there was no will or understand the positions, and then it's also somewhat hopeful that then it's when we have the understanding, then there is sometimes better chance to work with the facts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariu, very much for this summary regarding the case of the Czech Republic. As you can see, in the meantime, I'm trying to share with our audience some helpful links about our speakers or the units where they are working or common publications. And in case of Marie, I want to say that with Carolina and Marie, we are together contributing to one of the new still in production books that will be focused on migration governance at the local level in Central and Eastern European cities. So stay tuned. And now I invite another colleague from another project, Melissa, to let us know more about Italian migration and integration governance. So Melissa, the floor is yours. We see the screen.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and good afternoon to everybody. So I agree with my colleagues that who anticipated me, in the sense that it's not an easy task to present all the migration and integration policies in Italy. However, in order to give you some insights about this system and also to present some criticalities and some possible answer to it, I decided to structure my presentation as follows. So I will present some of the policies, the main policies connected to integration in Italy. Then I will present some of the major limits of these policies connected to the migration and integration system in Italy. And then I will present and would like to discuss with you about the possible role of other actors that other actors play in integration practices and policies. So first of all, I think that it's very interesting also what my colleague said before me, in the sense that how a country is considered in relation to migration. In the case of Italy, it is quite not funny, but it is quite special in the sense that the politicians in Italy continue to say that Italy is not an immigration country or is a country of recent immigration, as Italy is mainly a country of emigration. However, the first big migration flows started to arrive in Italy in the 80s. So it is important also to understand how migration is framed from the political point of view and not only from the social point of view. Since Italy started to be an immigration country in the 80s, it is exactly during this period that it started to have some laws connected to migration. And in particular, the first laws connected to migration and integration concerned labor integration. And over the years, also because of the arrival of different governments, no, and the fact that they changed very, very often, the Italian legislation system connected to reception and integration changed different times. And we can say that recently there have been 3 decrees that impacted a lot integration policies in Italy. Just make me do a premise in the sense that I'm speaking here about the reception system, as in Italy there are no specific laws connected to integration, but integration is strictly connected to the reception policies. So that's why I'm presenting you the Italian reception system as an introduction to this presentation, and then we will think about specifically integration dynamics. So the first one of these decrees was introduced in 2018 under the first Conte government, and it is paradoxically called a security decree. So I agree about what was said before me, no? That migration is usually framed as a security problem by political establishment. So the security decree made integration services, reduced actually integration services that were provided by the reception system, and was partially modified by another decree that was proposed in 2020. But recently, under the Meloni government, another decree was developed that was decided after the Cutro shipwreck in 2023, and this new decree made some steps back in relation to the 2020 decree. So again, the integration system was reduced in terms of resources dedicated to integration services. Let me present very briefly how the Italian integration and reception system is composed of. So first of all, there are some hotspots that are the first level of reception system, which are basically the places where people are taken if they started to decide to start the asylum procedures. And this is very important as you know, in Italy you cannot there are very few possibilities, very limited possibilities to arrive as an economic migrant. So the majority of the people start their procedure in order to ask asylum. Those who don't do that, actually, or they're brought to CPR, which are really some detention center and repatriation centers, or they're left in the Italian soil under irregular condition. Once the asylum procedure starts, then people can go to government centers, but the places available there are very little. So the majority of people goes to extraordinary reception centers or to temporary reception facilities. Here we can start to see actually that, as in the previous cases, migration is dealt with different levels of governmental levels. So not only the central government, but also by local authorities, for example, and private entities. In the case of the extraordinary reception centers, for example, they can be assigned through a public competition, a public award procedure that is decided then by the prefectures. Then with the Cutro decree, other kinds of facilities were introduced that limited even more the integration services. And then there is a third level integration and reception system, which are the SAI. Also here, the Cutro decree reduced the services dedicated to integration. For example, now the services are only dedicated to some specific categories of asylum seekers and to protection holders. Among these categories are unaccompanied minors, for example, and people in vulnerable conditions migrations, people who arrive in Italy through humanitarian corridors, and people coming from specific countries such as Ukraine or Afghanistan, for example. Also, this third level of facilities is divided into two kinds of structure. The first one is for asylum seekers that of course, are part of the previous categories that I explained, and can provide some material, legal, and health and linguistic services in terms of integration. And then there is the second level, which is only for protection holders, which provides also integration services in terms of job opportunities. And then there are other services which can be funded by the government or from private fundings, but we don't have time here to explain it in depth. As I presented this reception and integration system, we can also start to see some flaws, some criticalities. First of all, the system is still based on the crisis management, since migration is defined as a crisis, as an emergency. And you can see this in the Italian case as the majority of the laws. Actually, there are no laws that manage migration, but the majority of these laws actually are legislative decrees. It means that they're promoted by the government and not by the parliament. So it means that the subject, the topic is considered a topic, an urgent matter by Italian government. The second critical point is the reduction of integration services. As I said, by the introduction of these different decrees, the integration services were more and more reduced. So what does it mean? It means that less and less people can benefit from integration services, and thus producing further marginalization. A third critical point is the mismatch, actually, between what is individual aspirations and what are the territorial needs. So in Italy, for example, asylum seekers also can work. This is different in comparison to other European countries. However, they cannot choose where to live. It means that usually there is a mismatch between the competencies of people who arrive in the Italian soil and the territorial needs, the different territorial needs in terms of, for example, of job seekings of the different municipalities. And then, of course, as I think it is a common point with other countries, there are no sufficient resources in order to support integration services, and a financial reform would be needed. But as I explained, the tendency is completely the opposite. And another point that is making the things even more difficult is the fact that the Italian government is unstable. So the fact that different governments succeeded themselves meant that there are different let's say, political opinion about migration. And then, of course, also the policies connected to migration continue to change. So starting from these criticalities in the Italian context, it is very important to see the wider constellation of actors that take part to the integration dynamics. In the case of Italy, for example, it is fundamental and crucial the role of the third sector organizations and civil society organizations. I would like to present you just very briefly a couple of examples and how they intertwine with migration dynamics and integration dynamics. Yungimundu, for example, is a social cooperative which was created in 1999 in the Calabria region, so it's the poorest region in Italy. And it was created in order also to not only to support the reception and integration system, but also to overturn the depopulation and abandonment dynamics that characterize this territory. So it is really interesting, this case, this combines both the integration services and also included economic integration and the defense of human rights against labor exploitation, that is an urgent matter in Italy. But it combines it with local development processes and with some projects connecting, for example, to sustainable tourism, artistic and craftsmanship activities and workshops, restaurants, the reconstruction of abandoned houses, and the recovery of abandoned lands. Another project which is quite interesting, Refugee Welcome. I think that you know this project as is not is present not only in Italy but in different European countries, and this is quite an interesting case and I heard that is the case of also of other countries. In Italy, the access to a house is still one of the biggest problem in terms of integration. So even if people can find a job, in the majority of the cases, it's very difficult for them then to find a house, even if they have a job. So Refugee Welcome in particular tries to match the need of people to find a house and integration dynamics in order to give people houses with an affordable price, and also to create some social relations that can support life in the hosting country. And then there are also some specific projects like side-by-side project that support the transition to the adulthood of unaccompanied minors, and the community matching project that is not only about finding a house, but also to just spend some time together and to create social capital within a community. A third project is Kipax, is still a social cooperative, like in the case of Cammini of Jungimundu, and it was developed since 2014 in the province of Brescia, in the north of Italy in this case. And Kipax not only supports micro-housing, so again, the problem of access to house, but it has also developed different projects, economic projects, that support the sustainability of the local territory, such as the an eco-world hotel and the recycling of second-hand clothes. Lately, they started other two projects that are quite interesting. One is around the recovery of an ecological park in the province of Brescia, and the other one is about the development of a district of sustainable agriculture in this province. So just to sum up, let me just share with you some reflection about this crucial role of the third sector and civil society organization in integration dynamics. First of all, a very interesting point is the fact that these actors try to develop their own activities in order to be less and less dependent on the public funding connected to integration and reception of migrant people. It means that, and this is especially important in the case of Italy, as we saw the instability of the government is a challenge also to integration dynamics. So, and also because of the reduction of the resources connected to integration policies. So it is very interesting to see how these actors try to develop their own activities in order to be independent. Second, by doing this, they also sort of overturn the framing of migration as a crisis in order to make it a normal process that interests the Italian context. So they also, let's say, act on the narrative level in order to reframe migration itself. Another point that is quite crucial is that they're sort of warrant for decent jobs, and they try to defend the rights of workers, which is important in different countries around Europe. And the last and maybe most pivotal point is that by doing these activities, the third sector doesn't only work at the level of integration dynamics for migrant people, but it works for the whole community. It means that from the one hand, it reduces potential conflicts and social polarization connected to migration. From the other hand, they act as local connectors in order to support wider local development processes. So thank you very much.
Grazie, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Melissa. And now we are moving to our next speaker, Vilde.
Yes.
Let us see your presentation. Perfect. Let's try its full screen option.
Do you see the full screen option now?
Now, no, we've seen it for a while, so I suggest to leave it as it is, just to move a bit the slides that you can see on your left. So just to reduce. If not, we will stay as it is.
Yes. Do you see it now better?
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Okay, let's do it. Okay. Yes, so I will present a rather different case of the Norwegian case of integration and refugee settlement policies. So I'll first give a little bit of context of the Norwegian case, and we'll go through the reception and settlement policies, the integration policies, and some dilemmas and lessons learned from Norway that has many years of experience with this, these kind of policies. So it's important to just remember that Norway is a social democratic welfare state with very extensive welfare state policies. And that provides a context that is different from many of the other countries we're talking about today. And they also have a long history of having nationally regulated settlement and integration policies. It happened before 2004, but since 2004, it has been a national integration policy with specific regulations about the program, about settlement, etc. So we have a long experience with this. And just context as well, Norway is not an EU member or part of the CEAS, but we're part of the European Common Asylum System. No, the EEA. And Norway is also a unitary state.
Me how
Okay, I heard something, but I'll continue.
My colleagues from Migration Academy, could you please just mute everyone who disturbs, because maybe this by accident.
Yes, okay. And Norway is a unitary state, which means that the national state can mandate the local governments to do service provision, for example. But it's, as I will show, there has been a very close, Norway is characterized by having a very close central-local cooperation in both the policy development and the implementation. And I'll give you examples of that afterwards. So if we go directly into it, when it comes to accommodation and settlement. So the accommodation and settlement services during the application process, if you apply for protection in Norway, that is a national responsibility, like in most countries. So a national agency in Norway, the immigration agency, outsource the reception and housing services to non- and for-profit providers, which they have yearly contracts with. So during high influxes like in 2015, 2016, and 2022, they mostly upscale the contracts they have with existing providers, but they also, of course, need to expand this with other providers. And in these cases, they also supplement with hostels or hotels for temporary accommodation during the high influxes. And normally Norway has rather strict requirements for whether you can live privately and still receive some funding from the from the public government, or if you have to live in a reception center. So normally the rule is if you need any kind of assistance, you have to live in the public reception centers. But there are some minor exceptions, and there were also a temporary exception for Ukrainian displaced persons that had more options to live privately and still receive some funding or financial assistance during this period. After you are granted protection in Norway, so I mainly focus on this group now, protection seekers and those who are granted protection, Norway has a very specific settlement model. So in Norway, what happens after you're granted protection is that we have a national agency that petitions all municipalities, or the specific municipalities, depends on how many we need, based on prognosis. So if we know that we need 30,000 settlements next year, or have the prognosis, they will ask the municipalities, can you settle 100, can you settle 1,000, depending on how big they are and past integration results, etc. And then the municipalities have the autonomy to either accept, reduce or increase, or just reject the whole number. So they can say, no, we will not settle any refugees. Or they can say, yes, you petitioned us 100 refugees, and we can settle these ones. And this decision is locally, a lot of the time it's just the administrative decision that they usually just accept what, see what they have the capacity to, but it can also be a local political decision where the left-right political spectrum plays in. And then after the municipality says, okay, we can accept 40 individuals or 3,000, depending on the number in 2025, then the national agency delegates the individuals who are accepted for being granted protection in Norway. And for this service, and I'll get back to that, the municipalities get state funding for up to, if you accept the municipality, you get state funding per capita for 5 years to provide housing and integration programs, etc. So what this implies for the individual is that the self-settlement outside of the system is restricted. So the individual are not free to settle wherever they want if they want financial support and integration measures. So if you make it on your own, you can pay your own rent and you get a job immediately, you can settle wherever you want in Norway. But if you need any public assistance, then you have to settle through the public system. There is one exception, which is called agreed self-settlement. And that is when, if you find housing in a municipality, you can ask that municipality to rather accept you as part of the municipal quota that they have accepted. But the municipality can say no and say, no, you have to go through the public system, or they can say, yes, you can be part of our quota of 50 people that we're gonna settle today or whatever. So this agreed self-settlement has been there since 2016, but it's not been widely used, but it was much more widely used after 2022 for Ukrainians, at least in the initial phase. So if we turn to integration measures, we have an integration law since 2004, but it was recently revised in 2021. So this is the status quo. So the target group of Norwegian introduction program is refugees and people who have family reunited with refugees. So work immigrants, etc., do not have the same rights for integration programs in Norway. The program after 2021, before that, it was mostly a 2-year program, up to 2-year program for almost everybody. But after 2021, they differentiated the rights. So it can vary between 6 months and up to 4 years. And it depends on your age at arrival and your prior education. So for example, all people who are under 25 years and doesn't have upper secondary education or high school should get an introduction program that includes that you should get Norwegian high school. If you are have higher education from before, then you are supposed to have shorter programs that should last between 6 months and 1 year, and they should be work intensive, for example. And if you're in between that, it depends on if your goal is further education or further employment, and then you adjust the time period. So it's kind of standardized, but diversified as at the same time with some categories for how long the introduction program is. And all of the programs are supposed to be full-time. And you have some obligatory content. So you have Norwegian language training is one of the main components, of course, especially in the beginning. You have civil courses, and every program should include either education-related measures, upskilling measures, or work-oriented measures, so work practice, subsidized employment measures, or different types of upskilling courses. And there's also a new after 21 like life mastering course, how to master your life. And for parents, it's obligatory to have a parental guidance course about being a parent in Norway, the rules, for example, there. And for participation in these programs, everybody get an individual financial benefit for, and if you don't participate, they withdraw the financial support, like day by day. If you have invalid absence from the program, your financial assistance will get cut. So in this way, it is obligatory. If you're financially independent, they can never not force you to participate in any of these things. Okay, so for the programs, the municipalities, the central local governance of these programs is that the municipalities are mainly responsible for the implementation. So the municipalities have the freedom to decide how to provide these services. They can include NGOs, they can contract out some of the services like language training to private providers, but they have the responsibility for these services being delivered, but how they are delivered is up to the municipality. They can have intermunicipal cooperation, for example, to provide these services as well. And as I said, they get a 5-year grant from national government to the municipality, where they get a larger sum the first year, a little bit less the second year, and then for the following years there's a shorter sum. And they have a per capita grant as well for Norwegian, to provide Norwegian language courses. So just to kind of summarize, or some reflections around the overall system in Norway. So when it comes to Norway, we will say we have a lot of national steering in this area, but we also have kind of extensive local and individual support. So in the central local governance relation, there has always continuous debate on how much the national government should regulate and how much autonomy the municipalities and local government should get. But they a lot of the time agree. So I think one of the success criteria in Norway is that they have a very close cooperation and dialogue between the central and local government in how to solve these challenges that you face. And the national regulations are a lot of the time argued to be there to ensure, first of all, that there's an equal service provision to refugees. So if you live in this municipality or another municipality, you should be entitled to the same rights, irrespectively of where you live. Secondly, the national regulations has also been argued to ensure an equal distribution of responsibilities among the municipalities, so that not all protection seekers go to one big city and they have all of the responsibility to provide all these services. So they are overburdened, for example, with the school capacity. So in Norway, you have the settlement model, and kind of ensures that refugees are distributed all over the country, for example. However, for the individual, we have both very strict individual rights and obligations. So it's a balance between these. So we have many individual obligations and restrictions, like you can't settle wherever you want. This will infringe and this infringes the individual autonomy. But at the other side, Norway also provides a lot of rights. So yes, you have to settle in this municipality, but when you settle there, you are entitled to integration support, rather in an international comparison, rather extensive financial support. You will get housing, so you are ensured some of these rights as well. So it's always been a debate the Norwegian debate always concerns about this balance between obligations and rights. So I think I'll stop there.
If that's it,
yeah.
Thank you very much, Vilde. You are also well organized in terms of time. So yes, stop sharing. And now I would like to invite our guest from Canada. So as you can see, we learn really broadly from our colleagues. Jennifer.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. I'm coming to you from Calgary, Alberta, so I'm 7-something a.m., but it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Marta and Carolina, for organizing, and just jumping right in. I do think, obviously, that Canada is an outlier in many ways, and I won't dwell on that too much, but a couple of we have among us political scientists, political geographers, I think that we have to observe the kind of cold water geography. I call it the cold ocean geography, where we're just surrounded by the US on one border and 3 very cold oceans, around the others. And I think this drives a geopolitics of humanitarianism that's quite distinct. And we've seen this. Canada gets to choose who it wants to let in, even on the protection and refugee side. So I think I just wanted to underscore that, because we have 2 tiers of welcome, I would say, and integration perhaps. And that is those who've been invited, come on in. Those who are asylum seekers, it's hard to get to Canada. It's the return policies are strong. And I just want to say that, because that doesn't get said quite enough. Our bordering practices are pretty draconian, but I won't dwell on that today, because we're talking about integration. Like Italy, and we heard about this earlier, asylum seekers can work upon arrival. However, they receive almost none of the integration supports that legal immigrants who come under our immigration categories, which includes resettled refugees who come in what's called the refugee class. So those integration supports from the federal level, and that's where I'd say the big money comes from. We're talking a budget at the federal level of 1.2 billion per year, and growing. But legal immigrants get housing support initially, income support initially. I'm speaking of resettled refugees in particular. Other categories, economic, more privileged immigrants, are expected, as we heard in the in other cases as well, to self-fund, but not necessarily self-settle. They're still totally eligible for all of these integration supports. Maybe they need language training, maybe they don't. But the federal government takes that initial plunge, and then just to the point of the questions we were asked to address, in Canada, provinces, which are akin, I'd say, to the German state, are the partners in providing things like healthcare and education and so on. The welfare state for asylum seekers, once they go off federal support, is they go to the province. So those are just a couple of quick points. But taking a deeper dive into the Canadian context, there's two main points I'd like to make. One is that Canada has, in the last 5 years, increased immigration tremendously, and beyond actually what many people in the academic space, whether they be economists, political scientists, geographers, social workers, have said is sensible. And that is from, in 2015, we were looking at levels of about 250,000 people a year. Now we're up to 500,000. And what this has done is created what many of the countries represented on the call today have experienced, which is intense housing pressures, rents going out the roof, local and, Canadian-born folk and people with permanent residence just getting really tense about those levels. And the majority of those people are not refugees, but rather coming in through other streams, economic, family and others, but it has changed the context for reception, for immigration and refugees from what it was, say, 10 years ago, certainly even 5 years ago. So I just wanted to make, that's one of the 2 points I wanted to make. The second point, and this picks up on Vilda's presentation just now too, is this push to bring not asylum seekers, resettled refugees chosen overseas, welcome to Canada, bringing them to Canada, but also wanting them to go to more rural areas. So that the idea is, spread the bounty of immigration across Canada. Even though you're coming as a refugee, you still might be going to a town of 15,000 people, or a city, I should say, could be 40,000 people. But, if you think in the Canadian context, 80% of all immigrants go to 11 cities. Now the federal government has decided, well, we used to send resettled refugees to 23 cities. We're going to expand that to 42 cities. And Canada's dealing with that situation too, which is to say, is that good policy? Are the services, the supports, and the welcome there? And that's a project that I'm looking at. That's why I'm in Calgary right now. I've had a good week of trying to figure out whether that, how to answer that question about whether. And again, there's a Norwegian and a Sweden equivalent here. Are those places welcoming, especially in this context of increased immigration, where, it's a very political issue at the moment. The Prime Minister is under siege for it, and that gives you just a bit of the political context. One final point in terms of the Canadian context, and that is at the federal level, an increase, especially, and I'm speaking here more on the protection and granting of refugee and asylum to people, a kind of approach which might be called response on the fly, which perhaps is akin to the experience given the crisis in Ukraine, but also since 2015 with so much of the region, people coming in, not in terms of any planned way. It seems the Canadian government is having trouble planning too. Rather than having a process and a program, it's continued to invent ad hoc responses, which some people might say is responsive public. It's not policy, but programming. And that is with the Afghans who came in 2021, most recently with people from Gaza, people from Sudan. Of course, the Ukrainian, we have the temporary visitor program. Basically, Canada copied the EU temporary directive that many of you have, all of you mostly. I think it was in order not to be sweeter than or less good than the European option. So we didn't want to become you know, a magnet, nor did we want to, you know, sort of lowball the supports that were available to Ukrainian folks seeking protection. So those are some of the contextual pieces that sort of set us apart, but also resonate with many of the talks that we've had already. As I said, the budget is huge at the federal level, 1.2 billion, but then that excludes education. We have something called Swiss workers, settlement workers in schools. And those are paid for at the provincial level. So there has to be a fairly good federal provincial consensus on destining, the word that we use in Canada, for, you know, who's going to go where. And so when it comes to refugees, there has to be a consensus there. What we're seeing, however, is, you know, is there a consensus on whether it's a good idea for somebody who's new to Canada, who's come as a resettled refugee, to spend their first year in Canada in a city of 15,000 people where there is no public transportation, where housing is tight and expensive, same as Calgary, even though Calgary's got 1 million plus people, a small city that has a large, let's say, meatpacking plant or something like this. These are real examples, but I won't name names, cities at this point. You've got people really struggling to try to get work at a meatpacking plant, but no transportation to get there. Where you see hope and some resonance is that the kids are doing extremely well, the kids of these folks who come, but it's, you know, it's the classic story where the first generation takes a really hard hit in terms of their own dreams, aspirations, skill sets, and the de-skilling that they face, whereas the kids have a much better chance at making a go of it. Okay, I'm jumping all over here, but I wanted to say something about the notion of integration. It was really interesting at the outset. Norway doesn't seem to have a Norway has been doing this since 2004, as Canada has too. We put a lot of money into it, but it's very hard to find that definition that we heard at the outset was missing in the German context. And I still find one of the greatest shortcomings about integration in Canada is we continue to talk about it solely, I mean, in terms of data availability, it's economic. We have a great immigration tax base, which is connected to people's, you know, time of landing, where they came from, what category of immigration they entered through. And basically, as you file your taxes, this can trace where you move, if there's any secondary migration within Canada. So we can see patterns of people moving from smaller cities to larger cities, etc. But it creates such a reductionist profile of you know, what people's contribution and what their integration into Canadian life might be. So of course, a lot of people are working at social inclusion and measures of that, but they just don't register nearly as strongly in the federal government context. So just to finish off, I'm gonna just, I think, close there. And I think it's really important to have the discussion, but happy to throw in any more comments and or respond to any observations or questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. As you can see, in the meantime, I was adding some additional publications websites. In case of Jennifer, this is the project closed in 2021 about the private refugee sponsorship. We have another project regarding this going on with the Polish colleagues' involvement. So now I would like to say merci to all our great speakers. I hope that you've learned a lot. And now it's time for Q&A session that will be moderated by our colleague from the Migration Academy, Magda Nazimek, but just also to express our gratitude to the colleagues that are among the audience. As I wrote, we have colleagues from international, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, local governments, and even the ministry that now plays a really vital role in Poland with the work on the new integration strategy/policy. So now, Magdalena, the floor is yours, and we have around 40 minutes for this part.
Thank you, and thank you so much for all the presentations. It was really, really interesting to hear how different it can look in different countries and different regions, but at the same time, how we are struggling with the very similar similar problems. So let's start with the questions which appeared in the chat. And the first one is going to Professor Magdalena Nowicka about the German system. German municipalities frequently report limited resources and insufficient capacity in managing migration. Have those challenges led to greater openness among municipalities to cooperate with German migrant civil society organization? If so, what form of cooperation have emerged and what are the strengths and weaknesses of those cooperations?
Yeah, that's true. The municipalities always need more money because they have very different tasks. But more recently, they stress this is not necessarily money for integrating refugees and foreigners, but monies to at all be able to provide services to the population, to the local population. So it's about schooling, which needs additional funding. It's about housing as a challenge to everyone. And of course, increased immigration might cause additional burden, especially if this is about very specific requirements that people might have due to the lack of language skills and so on. Now, it's difficult to say whether the municipalities become less or more open, because many of these more than 11,000 municipalities have been very open and collaborating with different organizations, migrant organizations, NGOs, and so on. And this is usually in two different ways. One thing is that municipalities also run their own programs, funding some of the organizations. The other possibility is that organizations get funding from the federal, state, or the federal government programs, for example, from BAMF, or other funding, also EU funding. And then the municipalities collaborate with them on different occasions. And it's a mutual interest because, for example, organizations that provide sports activities to refugee youth might need schools and their sport halls as venues for such activities. There's a lot of collaboration between local labor market organizations or the offices in relation to vocational training and other forms of training, and this is ongoing. What is the major weakness is that all kinds of collaborations require coordination, and this is also resource intensive on the side of municipalities. Digitalization would be needed to be able to provide databases, a good overview of all kinds of organizations' activities that are active. And this is less so a challenge in small municipalities, but if we think about large cities where there are plenty of organizations providing very different services and activities and programs, this kind of coordination is a huge challenge. But there is a lot of collaboration going on.
I would use a privilege of being a moderator now, and I would like to ask you more about the integration councils, because you mentioned that in your presentation. As I understand, it's to make possibility for migrants to be more present, to participate in some kind of decision-making process. Can you talk a little bit more about it, how it looks like, what are the competences of that kind of council? Is it some kind of election to that council, or it's appointed to be there? Because we are definitely lacking that kind of bodies, let's say, in Poland. So I think it's very, very interesting in our context.
There are different models, and some of these councils are elected in very different ways. It's regulated at the federal state level how the councils are elected, who can participate in the elections, how often, and so on. But usually these councils have more an advisory role and impact the policies in a very small manner altogether. It's also very tricky because this is all working on a voluntary basis. So also people who volunteer to be member of such a council, they usually don't get any money. They need some own resources to start to run for this office, for example, to start a campaign, to get voters and so on. So this is a huge restriction, and therefore the interest of migrants very often participating in this kind of councils is little, and the process is being less and less democratic altogether. And also the capacities are little. Some municipalities are very interested in having this integration, or foreigner councils, traditionally as they were called, and supports their activities quite a lot, also in such a way that, for example, the meetings are late in the afternoon, but also migrants very often have care obligations. So there's, for example, some municipalities offer some childcare possibilities so that people can indeed, next to the regular job, participate. It's not everywhere there are this kind of councils established.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one more question. What areas of competitions and conflicts exist between different levels of integration governance in Germany? Additionally, how the UN level influence those dynamics?
Mm-hmm. Of course, there are different conflicts. In particular, this is also considered that there can be different political parties involved. So if there's the street light, there's this traffic light coalition in the federal government, and then there are states run by the Christian Democrats, for example, and the municipalities that would be entirely run maybe by green parties. There would be automatically a different idea around the integration policies. There are, of course, rules, collision rules, in terms of regulating the relationship between the state and the federal government and the federal states. This is again differently according to the field. So, for example, the primary responsibility for immigration policy would be with the federal government, but the federal states can block some of the projects, and that does happen. On the other hand, a more or less equal responsibility for policy in the area of housing is given both to the federal government and to the federal states. So there are different rules for how the negotiations are going on. What we know from working with municipalities that the tension is very often more discursive. So if the government, for example, federal government is now trying to restrict the immigration or to increase the return, support the internal intentions of the refugees, that not necessarily is a wish of the municipalities that are confronted with lack of labor force and professionals, and they see refugees also as a valuable labor force, and would rather wish that the government invests money in their qualifications. So there are different conflicts that are very often resolved. The EU does not directly play a role at the municipal and federal state level. But of course, it's more the competence in the immigration policy, and that's the collaboration with the federal government. Then.
Okay, thank you, Magda. And for now, we will go to Italy for a second. There is a question to Melissa. In the context of especially the southern Italian regions, could you comment on the intersections of migrant integration efforts by various NGOs and anti-mafia work? Do they go hand in hand? Were those cases or organized crime interference in that sector? Very specific question.
Yes, but thank you, Magdalena, and thank you, Anna, for posing this question. This is fundamental in the case of the Italian context, but I think that as the COVID pandemic showed, the vulnerability of migrant workers interest a lot of other countries in Europe. There is a strict link between these practices and the role of NGOs and associations and cooperatives in the fight against the labor exploitation, and especially that takes sometimes the shape of the grandmaster system in Italy. And I think that there are more or less 3 levels in the fight of it. The first one is some specific projects that deal with directly the exploitation in the fields, in the agricultural fields, for example, that have been made by these same organizations, some documentaries, some artistic projects that try to fight against labor exploitation. Then there is the direct presence of activists in the agricultural fields. So they're there, many of them, they're part of those NGOs of these and of those organizations that work for reception and integration services. They're there directly in the field in order to advise people about their rights and also to give some basic services for those who decided to stay there anyway. So they play a fundamental political and not only economic and social role there. And then I think that there is a third level that is more, let's say, symbolic and culturally oriented, which is the fight of this by this association and third sector organization and civil society organization of mafia in terms of anti-mafia culture, in terms of sustaining an anti-mafia culture. And this is very important because it stresses a lot their crucial role in going beyond, in a certain sense, the concept of integration itself. As we know, the concept of integration was criticized by many scholars recently. For example, there have been introduced other concepts such as emplacement. So I think that this constellation of different actors, and not only governmental actors, that deal with integration dynamics shows us that integration can be something more complex and can have the benefits can be created for the whole community. And this is crucial, no, in order to go beyond the epistemological definition of integration itself. And I think it's even more important in a political, let's say, context like nowadays, where migration is strictly interconnected to social polarization. So to stress the idea that integration is not only for migrant people, but also for the whole community, and the benefits can be for everybody.
I would also like to ask you about because you said that in Italy people cannot decide where they can live. Is it similar like in Norway? The system is similar. And the other question is, who is deciding who can get an international integrational support? Because you said it's different groups, and for now it's among those groups are, for example, Ukrainians and Afghani people. So it's like, is it central decision? Is it like review every year based on some kind of numbers, data, research, or is it just like a political decision? How does it look like?
Yes, about this last point is decided by, there are different legislation, but in this case it was decided by the last legislative decree that reduced also the access to integration services. So in the case of integration services right now are given only at the third level of the reception system, and at this third level only specific categories. Also, I would like to criticize this term categories, that creates differences, and in terms of value of human life. But anyway, just to speak in juridical terms, so only some categories can have access to these services that are considered the more vulnerable. So this was decided within the decree. About the first question, yes, it is completely the same case of Norway. I didn't know it, but it's also interesting, no, through this discussion to find some similarities, in the sense that exactly as in the case of Norway, of course, people can decide where to go when they go out from the reception system. So if they are completely independent, they can decide where to go to live in the Italian soil if they have finished the procedure. So in the case, if they're refugees, if they're asylum seekers, they have to stay in Italy, of course, in order to finish the procedure. But because of clear reasons, now that can be access to job, access to language, access to house, the majority of them still depends on the reception and integration system. So in this case, people that decide to stay within the system cannot choose where to live, and this is quite a criticality, in the sense that, for example, also about what Jennifer was saying before, now there are a lot of projects, and one of these projects I work with Marta as well, that is called Welcoming Spaces Project, is about sending, let's say, people to live in rural areas. Sending, I say, because there is a commodification of people, of course, by this kind of projects in the majority of the cases. But what about their individual aspiration, and what about their competencies? Is it useful to send a person to live in a rural place if there are no specific jobs that this person can do or cannot do? So in the case of Italy, but I think it can be a common rule, there should be more dialogue between the different reception centers and actors that deal with integration and reception, in order to create a match between what are the territorial needs and individual skills and capacities and aspirations as well.
Yeah, exactly. This more individual approach in general in all those cases, in all those programs. Thank you so much. So now we will go back to Canada, and there is a question to Jennifer about the community sponsorship. What is the role of community sponsorship in the refugee integration in Canada? How big it is? How well does it work? Could you share your thoughts on this model's potential to address some integration challenges?
Well, that is a huge question. I'll take a few. I'll try to poke at the sides of it, and yeah, just offer a few observations. So in Canada, I mean, community sponsorship is a little bit different in terms of name in Canada. We have what's called private sponsorship, which sounds like maybe self-settlement, but it's really not. So for Canada, private sponsorship is a group of 5 people, sometimes more, getting together, putting their own money and their own time for 1 year, time to help people settle. These are all refugees, people who've met the refugee definition, either of Canada or of UNHCR, or both. And so that's private sponsorship. Community sponsorship in Canada is this blended system for us, where we have the state putting in 50% of the money, those sponsors I just mentioned putting in half the money. The sponsors are present, but the difference, the really important difference for everyone to understand, is that with private sponsorship, you can actually name the person you want to sponsor. Perhaps it's a human rights leader that has been in prison in Ethiopia, and you want they're getting out and they've been tortured and it's pretty awful, and you want them to have a pathway. So you decide that that's going to be your person, and you apply for them and you work with them, etc. With community sponsorship, and I think this is true in the UK, I'm not sure how it's rolled out in all the countries around the table here today, but community sponsorship is that blended program where UNHCR referrals are the candidates for sponsorship. So you don't get to choose. You can choose from the pool of people who meet the UNHCR vulnerability criteria. So our government-assisted refugees, where the whole amount is paid for by the state, are also chosen from that same pool. UNHCR referrals, people who meet the UNHCR definition of vulnerability, etc. So where we've had success is on the private sponsorship side. Almost 500,000 people, if maybe a few more by now, have come to Canada over the last 44 years through the private sponsorship program. It's kind of this sleeper hit that works really well in Canada. And I can go into just a couple of the reasons why it's so successful. Where we've had a complete bust and complete policy failure or program failure is on the community sponsorship side. We have what's called the blended visa office referred category, which is this community sponsorship that we have in Canada. And the numbers for last year are under 200 people and going down. So it's been something that Canada has promoted since 2016, the GRSI, Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative, and it's been promoting it in Europe. And I've been, I've been a quiet critic because my view is let's do both and let's see what works, because different things may work in different places, and obviously what works in Canada may need to be fully rethought in the countries around the table today. But private sponsorship, in my view, is a much more solid and sustainable project because it allows newcomers themselves to also reach out, and if they've got a sister with a child who's still back in Lebanon, or in Amman, or perhaps in Nairobi, it's possible to reunite those extended families as well. So there's incredible drive for both Canadian-born sponsors who sponsored a family to help that same family, now permanent residents, to make a subsequent sponsorship. So you get an effect of bringing the people left behind together, and that's incredibly powerful. And the Canadian-born sponsors are as behind it as the family members trying to sponsor their kin. Again, it's not always family members. It could be a human rights defender. It could be someone who was your best friend in Beirut. Could be a number of different people. But all to say, those questions are big. I'll post something in the chat that kind of begins to answer those, and a Frontiers paper that's open access. But I thank you for your question. I don't want to take up too much more time, but thank you for that question. It's a big one.
Thank you so much. It's really important in a Polish context right now, because there are like projects around the community sponsorship. There are also like research projects around that. So I think soon it can be like a bigger conversation, bigger discussion about it in Poland. I will give a little bit space now for questions from Marta, because I know that she's eager to ask some. If she is now.
Yeah, so I'm jumping in with firstly the question that was addressed by our colleague Ashka from Polish NGO Forum. The question is addressed to all. However, I will ask two colleagues in the first place to refer to this question. So that's the question as it follows. Recently, I'm encountering on European level discussions a repeated statement that migration should become an economic issue, not a human rights issue. Do you also encounter that narrative in your context? What do you think? So this will be my question to colleagues from Norway and from Czech, but having these two specific countries, I will go with some questions from my side. So is there something from the practice of the integration and migration governance in your countries that might be a good advice, a good practice that might be helpful to Polish case, especially now when we are just working in academic terms, but also in legal and policy terms on the new, let's say, integration strategy, integration policy? And also, do you see any platforms, inclusive platforms, that can put together the representatives of different sectors, so NGOs, CGOs, central government, federal, local government, schools, etc., together to discuss these issues work on the common solutions, because we know that we have now this shift to have all sectors included, giving the voice to NGOs that played a significant role during the period of receiving forced migrants from Ukraine. So these are my questions, and I will ask my colleague Marie and then Vilde to briefly address these points. So Marie, let's start with you.
Okay, so to answer first the question about the economical aspect and human rights aspects. Well, this is, from my perspective, this is not new. And I would mention that we have an experience in Europe, but also in other continents, when the economic only or mainly economic migration was prioritized, and that we all know which issues it brought. So it's not it basically answers or destroys the image that once we support the migration, which we benefit mainly economically, that it would be like smooth and no problematic. So definitely this we know from many cases that this is not the case. Plus, second, what I find more important is that there are certain rules, values which consist or which influence and which creates our society. And one of the values is solidarity, and that we share about the others. And once we lose this value, it also completely changes our society. So I believe that the system of values which we share in different extents in Europe must contain also the value of solidarity, which then influence also migration or migration policies. So definitely, I think that it couldn't work, and we would go against the culture we have. Having said that, I think that still many European countries expect that the integration will go more smoothly than it can go. So in this case, I think that having the Canadian experience is good to know that there is a huge investment and huge effort needed, much bigger than we do now. So that would be the first question. And the second question, when it comes to integration strategy, well, I'm really glad to hear that things are moving in this case in Poland. And my comment would be to spend much more time on participative process of developing of this strategy and on discussing it very much longer and much deeper than you think. So I was heavily involved in creating the last and new concept of Prague's integration strategy. And even now, when we thought in the beginning, yeah, we know what we want, we have already talked about it with so many people, we go on well with the city government or municipal government and so on, it still took us 2 years only to finally agree on the vision. So I'm not sure if this is possible on the state level, because only in Prague we had like almost 90 different participants. It was time consuming, but then once we agreed on that, there is a shared agreement on that. And even when then the municipal council changed, and there are now many new people, because there was this agreement is, from my perspective, deeply rooted, then there is much greater will to follow the vision. And I think that there are examples similar from some cities. I'm not sure about the national.
Thank you, Marie. So it was so we fully support the concept of being and having this process based on participatory approach, and we are trying to do this at central level even this summer break on Guillaume, and that's good. But I'm afraid that our calendar is much more tight. So 2 years, it would be too long, but it's a good point. So now I would like to give the floor to our last speaker, because we are close, shortly coming to the end. So Vilde, now your turn to address the questions.
The first question I think is very interesting, because in Norway I think it's kind of opposite. Is with this should we have this economic should migration be an economic issue, particularly when it comes to refugees? One of the critiques now is that protection seekers are treated as an economic issue, and should they be? Because in Norway it's always combined with the discussion of the survival of the welfare state. If refugees come and are not do not transition to employment, then it will be a burden for the financial sustainability of the welfare state. So in Norway, the debate has more been that we do categorize protection seekers and refugees in economic terms and calculate if this will be a threat to the welfare state in Norway. And then you kind of forget that these people didn't come as work migrants. They didn't come as economic migrants. So I think that's an interesting, a very different debate in Norway about how framing them as economic migrants. Then you kind of forget why they actually came, not to benefit us. But of course, it is within the overall discussion that it needs to be sustainable as well. When it comes to the second one, I think, like Maria also said, the good practice I would highlight is the good cooperation between horizontally and between different levels of government. I think there are a lot of challenges in Norway, and I just presented how it was now, not all the benefits and the challenges we have with these positions. But one thing I think we do have in Norway is that immigration policy is very polarized, very polarized. Integration policy is not that polarized. It's been building on a long cooperation between the central and local government, between different sectors. They have a lot of established forests between ministries. We have a lot to do on this part as well, but I think that is some of the things that actually work. So we together work, and with the research community as well. It's not a very strong polarization between the research community and the politicians, for example. So I think that the good cooperation where you can discuss these challenges and dilemmas openly, and that needs a lot of work, or the good for us to do that, and lessons learned across. So maybe that will be the kind of overall good practices, because to say that other countries are gonna fund the way Norway funds the municipalities is unrealistic. There are different traditions here. But maybe that could be a learning point that is doable in all contexts, more or less. Yeah.
I have one more question to you, because you said that this integration and programs are mainly for refugees, for people who are already granted refugee or who are in the process, but then also Ukrainian were somehow under this program. Is it how it exactly looks like? Is it for only people who are seeking protection? Is there any program for economical migrants also, like maybe different one? How it looks, how there are differences between them?
In Norway, generally, Ukrainian refugees got the same rights. There were some shorter courses, and the overall goal is kind of different. So there's some modifications, but compared to other European countries, we provided integration programs and language courses for free for Ukrainian refugees as well. It is a dilemma. They're here short term, but we know that many of them will not be. So it's kind of a split that the government is standing in. When it comes to family migrants that are reunited with Norwegian citizens, for example, or work migrants, it kind of underscores the whole what integration is in Norway is labor. Financing the welfare state, we need you to work. We need women to work. That is the main thing. Integration policy in Norway is just about transition to employment. So it's a very narrow definition. But the logic in Norway, and not saying I agree with it, is that if you get employed, everything else will work out. Then you will learn the language, you will be socially integrated. And we know from work migrants that is not the case, but that is the story in Norway. If you get employed, everything else, all the integration issues kind of works out. So for work migrants, they need to pay for language courses themselves if they're going to take it. The employer should do it. If you are a family migrant to a Norwegian, they have to support you. So work migrants and family migrants, they support themselves, and then they're not a burden for the welfare state. So they haven't been prioritized in getting integration programs. So that has more or less, it is debated now, since we have studies to show that work migrants, for example, do not socially integrate, do not learn the language. So the rationale that employment naturally leads to integration, social integration, all these other things is kind of bursted. But it's been the mantra in Norway for so many years. So it's just new that we're kind of bursting the bubble, that this is not an automatic way and that employment solves every issue. That has been the mantra in Norway, I have to say.
Okay, thank you. That's also very interesting, because in Poland we have definitely different support for people from Ukraine and people who are seeking for asylum or are already granted it. So it's like different groups, but also probably different numbers of groups.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's really hard to compare. Yeah, I think it's we have just 3 minutes, so I don't think we have time for another question now, to not make it short. So thank you so very much for your participation, and all the people who are listening to our discussion. There is gonna be video of this webinar, so if someone miss it, still can check it and recommend it to your friends and family. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you next time.